Hi everyone, I'm back with lecture 2 for Intro Print. Hopefully you all have watched the first lecture, which was uploaded in 2 parts, and also watched the video from How We Got to Now that I asked you to watch. You've also hopefully been assigned a group to discuss your paper proposal with. If you did not reply to the survey I sent out, you were not put in a group. So you're going to need to go ahead and reach out to your classmates and find some people who will welcome you in. Anyway, I want to get into the rest of the content about the history of printmaking. We started in 40,000 years ago, and we ended with Gutenberg around 1450. And so today we're going to go from Gutenberg until the late 1800s. So again, your paper project topic can be anything that's happening in this whole era, sort of up through the Industrial Revolution and into the Victorian era. So let's get started. Having watched the clip from How We Got to Now, which is a really great PBS series that you might be interested in continuing to watch, we learned about something called knowledge spillover or information spillover. And this is an economic term which refers to innovations often leading to additional and unintended innovations and proximity of sharing ideas. The fact that new inventions and new ideas often come places that are densely populated and where people can build off the ideas of each other. So we see this in Germany with Gutenberg, who was living in Mainz, Germany. And I may be pronouncing that wrong. I'm sorry. I'm from Missouri. I have a very twangy accent, so you'll have to forgive me. Mainz was a wine capital, and so as we saw in that film, the the machine that was used to crush the grapes, a grape pressing machine, was what was adapted into a printing press. This was also a center for the church. So there were people who were literate. There were books that were in demand. There were scribes there making books. So the location, the wealth, the tools that existed in this city were really important to the development of the printing press. Gutenberg may have also been involved in copperplate printing, which was another form of printmaking that was coming into play in this region at this time. Copperplate printing is an intaglio printing method where instead of carving away what you don't want to print, you draw or carve into a plate and then rub ink into the cracks. So you're printing from the low-lying areas and not the high areas of your matrix. We'll get into this more as the term goes on and as we start actually printing, but relief and intaglio printing are terms that you should be familiar with. Relief printing being letterpress or a linoleum block, something where you carve away the areas that you don't want to print. Intaglio printing is something like it's inked like you would apply grout. You rub the ink across the surface and then it gets into the cracks and the crevices, and then you wipe the top clean, and that's how the press picks up ink. Again, we'll go into this more later, but I think it's important to note that intaglio printing is a newer process. If you Google etching or intaglio printing, you'll see plenty of images. And you'll notice they look very traditional. There's a particular look. You can get these very fine lines with that process. A dollar bill, things like that that have these very fine lines. That's traditional etching style. So the important thing to remember about Gutenberg is that the printed word became a catalyst for the modern world. Up until this point, as we mentioned last time, a book was worth as much as a vineyard. Books were few and far between. Scribes in the church were the only people that were literate, that were creating books. Knowledge was very limited. And so as the printing press becomes more and more prevalent, more and more used, cheaper and cheaper, books are available. Whoops. to everyday people. And of course, this takes time, but it creates literacy. As we saw in that video, it creates a need for people to see, which breeds the invention of eyeglasses and lenses, which, as we know, that invention leads to microscopes and telescopes and all these major scientific breakthroughs. So the printing press was a really major, it was a major domino in what we think of as technology of the modern world. So some important things, again, about the printing press and why it was such a revolutionary invention. The first is that it was the first mechanization of a handcraft or a skilled process. This is a time where the Industrial Revolution has not happened. There aren't factories. There aren't divisions of labor. People are making things at home by themselves. People are subsistence farming. And so it's a step towards these major ideas about mechanization and industrialization. It decreases illiteracy. People can afford books. Printed material can be made and hung up. This increases the spread of political ideas. Again, it takes the power out of the hands of the church because books do not have to be made by individual scribes, hundreds and hundreds of hours. People can create and produce books more cheaply. You don't have to be as rich as the Catholic Church to create literature. And finally, the formation of national identities and the standardization of language begins to happen. If you remember, or if you look at a map of Europe up until this time, a lot of places we think about today, major countries, even Germany, were sort of loosely affiliated states. There were city-states in Italy. There was not this kind of country or governance or modern ideas about how you thought about where you're from or what your nationality was. Another great quote from the History of Graphic Design by Meggs: typography created a sequential and repeatable ordering of information in space that encouraged linear thought and logic. It inspired a categorization and compartmentalization of information that formed the basis for empirical scientific inquiry. It fostered individualism, a dominant aspect of the society, of Western society, since the Renaissance. So again, there's a need now for everyone to learn the alphabet, for you to understand alphabetization, putting things in order, recombining letters, understanding types of processes that we maybe take for granted now, but that the common person didn't need. Again, the idea of setting up categorization, compartmentalization, and ordering was part of what helped move us into the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and then, of course, later on, the Industrial Revolution. A quote I always like to mention when we're talking about the history of printmaking is this Whitehead quote. The major advances in civilization are processes which all but wreck the societies in which they occur. So major changes, the internet in a more contemporary setting, the telephone, the printing press, they change the world so dramatically that society can very rapidly become almost unrecognizable. This can often wreak havoc if you think about all the people who were involved in being scribes, or the people who were tanning parchment, or all the parts of society that were built around particular ways of working before the printing press and paper made their way to Europe. This had devastating effects on many parts of the economy. So it's important to remember, as much as we think about the printing press being something that brought learning and education and democracy, there certainly were negative consequences, and that there's no progress without some pain.